Hey guys, tonight we begin with a cozy little journey into the quieter, often overlooked corridors of history. You might want to dim your lights, maybe pull a blanket over your lap, and settle into a chair that will not judge you for staying there for hours. We're going to meander through the secret lives of some queens who, for reasons that remain mostly inconveniently dull to general history textbooks, have largely been forgotten. Not because they weren't important, oh no, but because they didn't quite fit the dramatic mold of kings storming castles or inventing taxes that everyone hated. No, these were women who played the royal game with a strange mix of patience, strategy, occasional mischief, and a lot of very slow, quiet suffering. And because it's a sleepless historian production in your head, we'll glide gently through their stories, letting the facts lull you rather than shock or excite. Let's float first over to Eleanor of Aquitaine, because of course, we have to start with someone whose name you've probably heard in passing, but whose life is far more expansive than your high school history teacher could comfortably explain before lunch. Eleanor was born in 1122, which is really a wild time if you think about it. Europe was slowly crawling out of the early medieval muck, but still had plenty of mud, lice, and oddly specific rules about who could marry whom without causing the apocalypse. She was the eldest daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine. And, well, she inherited a massive duchy because why not give a teenage girl control over something roughly the size of modern France's Gironde region? That's like giving a high schooler your credit cards, your house, and the city planning department. Now, Eleanor's early life, while outwardly privileged, was probably a quiet parade of mild annoyances and awkward court functions. Think banquets with food that had been sitting out long enough to grow its own personality, and endless discussions about land boundaries with men who were trying very hard to look intimidating while wearing pants that could double as tents. She was educated, which was unusual, because most girls at the time were being educated in either the domestic arts or in the very specific skill of not questioning men. Eleanor, however, could read, write, and debate theology with a monk without ever needing to pretend she didn't know what she was talking about. This would later make her a bit dangerous, socially speaking, but also extremely effective. And yes, she had a temper, though it mostly manifested in quietly seething until she could enact plans that were, if not revolutionary, at least very inconvenient for anyone who had annoyed her. By the age of 15, Eleanor had married Louis VII of France. Now, if you're imagining a wedding that involved delicate flowers and romantic vows, let's temper that a bit. Marriages among royalty were rarely about romance and mostly about strategic land acquisition and the gentle subjugation of human feelings to political necessity. Still, Eleanor must have found Louis mildly disappointing. He was pious, bookish, and devoted to an idea of virtue that probably involved very specific rules about fasting and the correct angle at which to fold one's hands during prayers. Eleanor, by contrast, seemed to enjoy a slightly more robust sense of fun. And by fun, I mean she reportedly went on pilgrimages, funded crusades, and generally acted in ways that suggested she found mild chaos somewhat soothing. The two of them were married for about 15 years, and during that time they had a couple of daughters, but inconveniently for dynastic purposes, no sons. In medieval Europe, that was the sort of problem that could quietly erode one's marriage in a way that made people whisper about annulments as though it were the polite thing to do. Which brings us to the famous annulment of 1152. Eleanor and Louis had their marriage declared invalid, mostly on the grounds of consanguinity, which is a fancy way of saying they were too distantly related for comfort. But everyone knows the real reason was more practical. The marriage hadn't produced a male heir, and medieval politics had very little patience for female complications. Eleanor, being Eleanor, didn't sulk in some castle corner. No, she went on to marry Henry, Duke of Normandy, who would shortly become Henry II of England. This was in some ways the start of the famous Angevin Empire, which was really just an enormous, awkwardly glued-together collection of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Eleanor became Queen of England at 33, which in today's terms might feel late for a first marriage, but in medieval terms meant she was entering her prime for intrigue, plotting, and gentle exasperation of her husband. Now, Henry II and Eleanor's marriage was complicated. Henry, of course, was clever, ruthless, and had an appetite for control that was more consistent than a metronome. Eleanor, equally clever and not averse to subtle manipulation, often found herself quietly frustrated. She had 8 children with Henry, which, let's be honest, must have been exhausting in every possible way. Medieval childbirth was not a spa experience, and Eleanor probably spent a fair amount of time lying down and contemplating her own patience, while also planning which of Henry's courtiers would benefit from sudden but quiet demotion. The couple famously quarreled, and in 1173, Eleanor supported a rebellion of her own sons against their father. Because why not double down? She was eventually imprisoned for 16 years, confined mostly to Windsor Castle, which sounds cozy if you ignore the lack of Netflix, fresh air, and autonomy. Despite the imprisonment, Eleanor survived. And not just survived, she emerged politically active, mentoring her sons, influencing English governance, and occasionally attending court with the sort of quiet dignity that makes you think she was probably plotting multiple feuds at once while knitting or doing some other medieval equivalent of scrolling on her phone. She died in 1204 at the age of 82, which is impressive by any standard, but especially impressive when you consider she had spent a significant portion of her life married to one man, rebelling against another, and running an empire in which everyone seemed determined to annoy her. Let's drift gently to another queen who never got quite the fame Eleanor did, though she was arguably even more enigmatic. Margaret of Anjou. Born in 1430, Margaret was French by birth, but ended up Queen of England through marriage to Henry VI, a man so fragile and pious that historians occasionally wonder if he was just trying to nap his way through life. Margaret, by contrast, was ambitious, cunning, and, to be honest, probably rather tired of the slow-motion chaos surrounding the Wars of the Roses. She was married at 15, which again is a recurring theme you're probably noticing. Teenage brides, medieval dynasties, everyone pretending that emotional maturity was a minor suggestion rather than a requirement. She quickly discovered that Henry was more interested in his prayers than in ruling an unstable kingdom, which left her to do most of the heavy lifting politically. Margaret's life is a slow, almost sleepy parade of court intrigue, battles of influence, and occasional heartbreak. Her husband suffered from recurrent bouts of mental instability, which meant she often acted as the de facto ruler. She made alliances, negotiated truces, and tried to keep her family alive, while kings and dukes flitted about like slightly confused moths around candle flames. She had one son, Edward of Westminster, who tragically died in battle, which was both a personal heartbreak and a political disaster. Margaret herself was captured and ransomed multiple times, which is a reminder that medieval queens were not merely decorative. They were often bargaining chips, military assets, and, occasionally, the sort of people who could quietly orchestrate things while everyone else assumed they were fussing over embroidery. It's worth noting the curious emotional tenor of Margaret's life. Unlike Eleanor, who seemed to glide through political entanglements with a sort of ironic amusement, Margaret's life was tinged with grief and quiet desperation. She lost power, lost family, and eventually died in relative obscurity in France in 1482. Yet even in her loss, there is a strange dignity. She was, in many ways, a queen whose life was defined by necessity rather than desire, a recurring motif among the queens we'll meet tonight. And if we drift slightly north, we encounter Margaret Tudor, who brings us back into a quieter, calmer world of dynastic frustrations. Born in 1489, she was the older sister of Henry VIII, a man who would become legendary for marital experimentation and mild family chaos. Margaret, in contrast, was married off to James IV of Scotland as part of a treaty arrangement. She was Queen Consort of Scotland, which sounds serene, until you realize that she was a foreigner in a country where trust was in short supply, and Scottish politics resembled a slow-motion chess game where half the pieces were occasionally on fire. Margaret's life was punctuated by political maneuvering, religious tension, and, eventually, widowhood at the age of 35. She remarried, which caused a scandal because widowed queens were never supposed to have opinions, let alone husbands. She spent the rest of her life navigating Scottish and English politics in a careful, almost sleepy dance of survival. By the time she died in 1541, she had lived through enough dynastic drama to fill several books, though most textbooks are content to mention her as Henry VIII's sister, which, as you might imagine, is a rather reductive summary of a long, complicated life. We could linger here forever, tracing queens whose lives are defined not by the loud crashes of history, but by quiet persistence, strategic patience, and the occasional small rebellion. These are women who managed estates, bore heirs, and occasionally, just occasionally, flouted convention in ways that were noticeable enough to leave traces but not dramatic enough to dominate headlines. Their lives are, in a sense, the perfect lullaby for anyone trying to drift into a historical reverie. You can follow the threads of their ambitions and frustrations without ever needing to worry about sudden action or cliffhangers. Let's pause briefly on Anne of Brittany, who was born in 1477 and lived through the very slow expansion of French royal authority. Anne was married twice, both times to kings of France, and she spent much of her life negotiating the tricky balance between her own duchy's autonomy and the slow creep of central power. She was intelligent, patient, and politically active, qualities that allowed her to navigate the royal court without the dramatic flair that gets people remembered in legends. Her life was marked by careful planning, quiet resistance, and eventually acceptance of her role in the royal machine. She died relatively young, at 36, which makes her accomplishments feel both impressive and tragically understated. And so we continue, floating gently through the lives of queens whose stories have not been sensationalized. These women remind us that history is not only about wars, revolutions, or loud proclamations. Sometimes, history is the quiet unfolding of someone managing a household, raising heirs, negotiating treaties, and surviving the slow, relentless march of time. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Margaret of Anjou, Margaret Tudor, Anne of Brittany, all of them exemplify this quieter, more intimate form of historical significance. Their triumphs and frustrations are not recorded in fiery battles or dramatic speeches, but in letters, treaties, and the subtle shaping of dynasties. All right, let's float over now to another corner of Europe where dynasties collided in slow motion and queens had to quietly navigate a maze of expectations, etiquette, and occasionally inconvenient husbands. This next group of women might not appear in your standard history textbooks, unless the textbook was written by someone with an unusual fondness for obscure dynastic footnotes. First, let's meet Joanna of Castile, who was born in 1479 and would later earn the rather dramatic nickname Joanna the Mad. Now, before you imagine wild hair, chains, and incessant screaming, which, to be fair, is exactly how most people remember her, let's take a calmer approach. Joanna's life was mostly sad, slow, and incredibly controlled by the men around her, which, in medieval terms, is almost equivalent to a personality-maximizing catastrophe. She was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, which meant she had royal blood coursing through her veins, along with all the responsibilities and annoyances that accompany being a female heir in a kingdom obsessed with succession. Joanna married Philip the Handsome of Habsburg fame, which seemed like a lovely arrangement on paper. Political alliance, strategic advantage, and presumably an acceptable dowry. The reality, however, was far more tedious and psychologically taxing. Joanna's husband Philip had a habit of traveling, scheming, and occasionally flirting with the general idea of power in ways that left Joanna both isolated and increasingly frustrated. She outlived him by several years, but the years in which he ruled alongside her were punctuated by small, exhausting dramas, disputes over territories, questions about legitimacy, and endless letters that required careful responses lest kingdoms fall into chaos. The nickname the Mad comes largely from her melancholic and obsessive tendencies. She was prone to intense grief, especially after Philip's death. But in reality, much of what people call madness today might just be a woman reacting reasonably to a world that gave her very little control. She spent her final decades confined to palaces, a queen in title but a prisoner in practice, carefully monitored by her father and later her son. And yet, in that quiet, slow-moving confinement, Joanna remained a figure of dignity, a woman whose sadness was profound but mostly silent. It's the sort of melancholy that doesn't explode, it seeps. and eventually, after centuries, becomes historical legend. Drifting north to Scandinavia, we meet Margaret I of Denmark, a queen who managed to accomplish what few medieval rulers, male or female, ever did. Born in 1353, Margaret was married to Håkon VI of Norway as part of an elaborate political arrangement. She outlived her husband, which, as we've noticed, is not unusual for queens, but she also outlived most of her contemporaries in terms of political influence. By the late 14th century, she had managed to unite Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown. Impressive, you might think. And yes, it is. But Margaret was quietly methodical, patient, and completely devoid of the dramatic flair that often accompanies tales of conquest. She managed her kingdom like a long, slow game of chess, carefully moving pieces, negotiating marriages, and occasionally sighing when courtiers insisted on being dramatic. She died in 1412, having reshaped Scandinavian politics without ever needing a dramatic battle or heroic speech. Her life is a lullaby of effective rulership, quiet, consistent, and oddly soothing when you think about it. From Scandinavia, let's drift over to Eastern Europe to the Polish-Lithuanian realm, where Bona Sforza reigned in the early 16th century. Born in 1494, Bona was Italian by birth, which immediately introduced a slight cultural tension into her life. She married Sigismund I of Poland, who was, by all accounts, a competent ruler, but not exactly someone to spark personal joy. Bona's life was a series of careful interventions in politics, the promotion of trade, and the slow expansion of her family's influence. She had a sharp mind for economics, which was unusual for queens who were mostly expected to produce heirs and smile politely. She was also rumored to have a slightly mercurial temperament, which made her courtiers simultaneously terrified and respectful. She died in 1557, leaving behind a Poland that was economically stronger but still deeply aware that a foreign queen had somehow managed to run things better than many native rulers. Her life, in the sleepy sense we're cultivating here, is about patience, subtle influence, and occasional, mild intimidation. Not dramatic, but effective, like a whisper that slowly moves mountains over decades. Now, let's wander back to France, where the tragic and almost absurdly misunderstood Marie de Medici was quietly reshaping a kingdom while everyone else was busy imagining her as a meddler. Born in 1575, Marie married Henry IV of France at the age of 14. By this point, we might be noticing a pattern. Queens frequently married very young, endured long waits to gain power, and quietly learned to navigate political chaos without anyone particularly noticing. Marie's life was a slow carousel of motherhood. She bore 6 children interspersed with periods of regency when her husband was assassinated and her eldest son was too young to rule. She attempted to guide France through these years with a mixture of patience, mild stubbornness, and the occasional diplomatic snub. History remembers her as overly ambitious, but in reality, she was merely trying to manage a kingdom while balancing an unwieldy family. She died in 1642, tired, perhaps misunderstood, and certainly aware that history would compress her complexity into a few paragraphs about favoritism and court intrigue. Meanwhile, in England, we have Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, who often gets mentioned only for being the one who survived him. Born in 1512, Catherine had been married twice before Henry, which was moderately scandalous for the time. She married Henry in 1543, and somehow managed not to die during their union, which, given Henry's history, is in itself a small triumph. Catherine was intelligent, religiously inclined, and interested in education, which made her a quiet influence over Henry's children. After Henry's death, she remarried and continued her work quietly until her death in 1548. Catherine's life is soothing in its own right because she represents survival and subtle influence rather than drama or spectacular rebellion. She knew how to navigate danger with grace, a skill many queens could have used more of, if only they'd been allowed. And floating further east, we reach the tragic and haunting figure of Elizabeth of Russia. Born in 1709, she was the daughter of Peter the Great, which already sets the stage for a life filled with high expectations and endless formalities. Elizabeth never married, which is mildly unusual for the period, and instead focused on governing with what might be politely described as an eccentric devotion to detail. She loved architecture, the arts, and the slow, careful management of her court. She banned capital punishment, which is a small but noteworthy historical footnote, and spent her reign quietly shaping the culture of Russia. Elizabeth's life is remarkable not for loud achievements, but for the steady, quiet cultivation of taste, order, and small, precise reforms. She died in 1762, leaving behind a legacy that is calming in its predictability yet impressive in its subtlety. It's fascinating to observe a recurring theme among these queens. Whether through illness, political necessity, or personal temperament, their lives were often defined by a slow accumulation of small, deliberate actions. Unlike kings, whose stories often involve sudden, loud exploits, these queens quietly endured, influenced, and occasionally rebelled in ways that history textbooks rarely find dramatic enough to headline. Yet their contributions were significant. They managed dynasties, advised sons and husbands, and, in many cases, quietly altered the political landscape of entire regions. Their struggles were internal, their victories measured in stability rather than spectacle, and their failures often invisible unless you know where to look. And if we wander briefly into the microcosm of daily life, there's another layer to explore. Queens had routines: waking before sunrise, attending mass, supervising household management, reviewing correspondence, and occasionally enforcing discipline among servants or courtiers. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, were rumored to enjoy hunting and outdoor sports, which might sound leisurely but in practice required stamina and focus. Others, like Margaret Tudor, navigated domestic politics with a mix of patience and tactical thinking, ensuring that estates were productive and alliances remained stable. These daily rhythms, while seemingly mundane, were in themselves acts of governance. A queen's attention to the slow details of life often determined whether a kingdom prospered or merely survived. So tonight, as you drift, imagine these women quietly walking through the corridors of palaces, surrounded by silks, letters, and maps, making decisions that were monumental yet invisible. Their influence is subtle, their stories slightly obscure, but the cumulative effect is astonishing. They demonstrate that history is not always a series of dramatic leaps and crashes. Sometimes it is a gentle, persistent shaping of reality by those who are patient enough to endure. Now, let's float over to the lesser-known corners of Europe, where queens ruled quietly, sometimes eccentrically, and occasionally left behind stories that feel almost like whispers from another time. These are the women whose lives weren't written in grand battles or celebrated in epic poems, but whose choices, habits, and tragedies shape dynasties in ways history often forgets. Take, for example, Maria of Portugal, born in 1527. Maria married Philip II of Spain, who was already managing a rather large and cumbersome empire. Philip was known for his seriousness, his devotion to Catholic orthodoxy, and a level of personal emotional restraint that would be impressive if it weren't so exhausting to anyone around him. Maria, by contrast, had a quieter, more subtle influence. She navigated Spanish court life with a mixture of prudence and mild frustration, often watching as her husband's ambitions stretched far beyond her immediate understanding. She bore children, managed households, and mediated courtly disputes, a role so tedious and prolonged it almost seems hypnotic to recount. Her life ended quietly in 1577, leaving Spain slightly better managed, slightly more complicated, and historians with the faintest trace of her influence to puzzle over. Meanwhile, drifting east, we find Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, later better known as Catherine the Great of Russia. Now, we're all familiar with her eventual reign, but her early life is a study in subtle, slow transformation. Born in 1729, Sophie was a minor German princess who married Peter III of Russia, a man widely remembered for a combination of incompetence, eccentricity, and general irritating behavior. Sophie's rise to power was not a series of dramatic coups and theatrical speeches, at least, not in the beginning. She spent years quietly learning Russian, understanding court politics, and observing the weaknesses of her new husband. Her cleverness lay in patience. She absorbed every insult, navigated every minor scandal, and waited for the precise moment when she could act decisively. Even in her early years, she displayed a quiet, almost surgical sense of strategy. History often remembers her for her later achievements, but the foundation of her power was this slow, persistent observation and adaptation, a gentle lesson in patience that might lull a listener into both admiration and a very mild sleepiness. Drifting slightly south to Italy, we meet Isabella d'Este, a figure whose life is quietly astonishing if you like your history measured in subtleties rather than swords. Born in 1474, Isabella married Francesco II Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, in a match that was politically expedient but personally complicated. Isabella's life was largely consumed with patronage, the management of courtly affairs, and the subtle negotiation of power behind the scenes. She commissioned art, corresponded extensively, and mediated disputes, all the quiet work of a queen who understood influence as a gentle, persistent pressure rather than a dramatic declaration. Her personality is recorded as intelligent, charming, and slightly imperious, which probably made her daily routines a mix of meticulous planning and small frustrations. She died in 1539, having carefully shaped Mantua's court, leaving behind a legacy that is more cultural than political, more enduring in libraries and galleries than on battlefields. Now, let's wander briefly to Scandinavia again, to the quietly tragic life of Christina of Sweden, born in 1626. Christina is remembered for her eccentricity, but the reality is subtler than the popular stories suggest. She ascended the throne at the age of 6, which, unsurprisingly, meant a life of slow, careful preparation and constant observation of adults whose intentions were rarely aligned with her own desires. Christina's personal quirks, wearing men's clothing, refusing marriage, devoting herself to learning and philosophy, were all small but persistent assertions of autonomy in a world that expected her to perform a role she had not chosen. She abdicated in 1654, choosing personal freedom over political obligation, a decision that is remarkable for its quiet dignity. Her life is a gentle demonstration of self-determination, of patience, and of the subtle ways one can influence a world even while stepping away from it entirely. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, there is the quiet story of Maria Theresa of Austria, born in 1717. Unlike some of the queens we've met, Maria Theresa was a mother, a ruler, and a bureaucratic force. She inherited a complicated empire and managed it with a combination of rigorous detail, strategic marriage alliances, and occasional bouts of mild exasperation at her children, of whom there were 16. She reorganized her administration, strengthened her armies, and reformed education and finance, all in a manner that is almost soothingly methodical if you imagine it as a slow river of careful planning. Maria Theresa's life was filled with long hours, meticulous correspondence, and the quiet frustration of being a woman expected to manage men's ambitions while supervising her own sprawling family. She died in 1780, leaving behind an empire more cohesive than the one she inherited, a quiet, persistent legacy of order rather than drama. And floating to the British Isles again, we find Mary II of England, who ruled jointly with her husband William III during the Glorious Revolution. Born in 1662, Mary was a princess, daughter of James II, and grew up in a world of dynastic tension and religious controversy. Her reign, though shared, was marked by calm, rational governance rather than heroic speeches or battlefield triumphs. She navigated religious disputes, administrative challenges, and a slow transformation of political culture with a mixture of patience, decorum, and quiet influence. Mary's personal life was marked by early widowhood. She died in 1694, but she remained a figure of stability and dignity, a queen who quietly supported her husband and contributed to shaping a more orderly state. Then there's Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Queen of Prussia, born in 1776. Louise's life is mostly remembered for her beauty and her gentle influence over her husband, Frederick William III, during the Napoleonic Wars. Her role was not military, not heroic in the conventional sense, but her diplomacy, her calm judgment, and her quiet encouragement of her husband were vital. She was involved in charitable works, corresponded extensively, and carefully maintained the public image of the monarchy. Her life ended in 1810, leaving behind a legacy of grace, calm, and subtle power. A queen whose influence was felt not in dramatic upheavals, but in small, persistent ways that shaped her kingdom over decades. We can also pause on the life of Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, Queen Consort of Britain and mother of George III. Born in 1719, Augusta navigated the British court with mild exasperation at political squabbles and personal intrigues. Her influence was mostly domestic, but she played a careful role in educating and advising her children, ensuring the continuity of the Hanoverian line. Her life is another example of slow, persistent influence. The day-to-day management of family, court, and expectations, all conducted with a quiet, calm dignity that almost lulls the listener into a reflective state. And finally, for this segment of our quiet historical drift, we can pause on Maria Anna of Austria, born in 1683, who became Queen of Portugal. Her life was largely shaped by dynastic necessity, careful navigation of court intrigue, and occasional personal frustration. She managed her households, supervised charitable works, and participated in ceremonial duties, all the quiet, almost hypnotic labor of queenship that often goes unnoticed in the grand historical narrative. Her death in 1754 marked the end of a long, steady life of patient influence, a life that demonstrates the consistent thread running through these forgotten queens: quiet endurance, subtle shaping of events, and persistent care of family and state. So tonight, as you drift further into contemplation, imagine these queens walking slowly through candlelit corridors, attending morning masses, reading letters by faint sunlight, and quietly influencing the world around them. Their triumphs were measured in patience, strategy, and subtle intervention. Their tragedies were often private, their eccentricities minor, and their influence cumulative rather than immediate. They are the perfect companions for a long, slow night of reflection, for drifting into historical reverie, and for appreciating the quiet persistence that sometimes changes the world more than loud action ever could. Now, let's drift toward the smaller kingdoms of Europe, the ones that often escape notice in textbooks. These realms may have been minor in political weight, but their queens were anything but minor in personality, eccentricity, or quietly tragic lives. Some of these women had influence that barely made the historical headlines, yet their personal choices, daily routines, and subtle maneuvers shaped dynasties in slow, persistent ways. Take Hedwig Jagiellon of Poland, born in 1573. Hedwig was a princess who married Elector Joachim of Brandenburg. By all accounts, her life was moderately dull, in the sense that there were no dramatic coups, no explosive scandals. Yet, her quiet patience and diplomatic tact kept two distant European courts from mildly annoying each other too much. She had children, oversaw households, and attended to court ceremonies, all of which was exhausting, tedious work that required subtle judgment rather than heroics. Hedwig's life is a perfect example of a queen whose influence was measured in daily maintenance of civility and stability, a sort of slow-motion governance that history rarely applauds, but without which chaos would have quietly accumulated. Meanwhile, let's float down to Portugal again, to Luisa de Guzman, born in 1613. Luisa married John IV of Portugal and played a pivotal, though understated role in the Portuguese Restoration War. Her influence was largely domestic and behind the scenes, although she occasionally nudged policy, offered counsel, and ensured her family maintained prominence. She had several children, managed households, and supervised courtly rituals with a patience that borders on hypnotic. Her quiet, persistent activity ensured continuity and order during politically stressful times. Louisa died in 1666, leaving behind an image of composure, efficiency, and subtle influence, a queen whose achievements are measured more in stability than in headlines. And floating north to Scandinavia again, we meet Hedvig Eleonora of Sweden, born in 1636. Hedvig married Charles X Gustav of Sweden and became regent for her son, Charles XI. Her life involved extensive court management, diplomatic negotiation, and careful cultivation of royal etiquette. She outlived her husband and many contemporaries, demonstrating a patience and resilience that is hypnotic if you consider it in the slow, cumulative sense. Hedvig's influence shaped Swedish politics for decades, but the details are buried in administrative correspondence, ceremonial records, and household accounts mundane, perhaps, but profoundly impactful over time. Her quiet persistence is almost lulling. She was the embodiment of the patient queen, carefully shaping events from behind a screen of decorum and ritual. Meanwhile, drifting toward France, we find Maria Leszczyńska, born in 1703. Marie married Louis XV of France at the age of 22, which is slightly later than many of her contemporaries, but nonetheless typical for dynastic arrangements. She bore 10 children, oversaw domestic affairs, and maintained a quiet influence in courtly matters. Her life is remarkable for its lack of dramatic scandal. She was neither a revolutionary nor a rebel, but she skillfully managed her family, her household, and her ceremonial duties with mild diligence. Her life demonstrates that queenship was often more about endurance and consistent, low-level management than about heroic action or dramatic intrigue. Marie died in 1768, leaving behind a legacy of careful domestic governance and patient service to the monarchy. We can also pause on Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, born in 1691, who married Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor. Elizabeth Christine's life was filled with careful courtly observation, management of ceremonies, and patient endurance of her husband's relentless focus on dynastic politics. She bore several children, oversaw the imperial household, and maintained a steady, quiet presence in a court known for intricate etiquette and mild tension. Her influence was subtle, almost hypnotic in its consistency. She died in 1750, leaving behind a court more orderly than it would have been otherwise a queen whose power lay in careful, persistent management rather than dramatic declaration. Meanwhile, drifting south again, let's consider Maria Louisa of Savoy, Queen of Spain, born in 1688. Maria Louisa married Philip V of Spain, a man whose bouts of melancholy and occasional irrationality created the perfect backdrop for a queen skilled in patient negotiation and gentle persuasion. Maria Louisa managed domestic and ceremonial duties, supervised charitable works, and quietly influenced her husband's decisions without ever needing to storm a council chamber. She died in 1714, leaving behind a reputation of tact, patience, and calm influence, a subtle yet effective form of royal power. Then there's Louise Elizabeth d'Orléans, born in 1709, who became Queen of Spain through marriage to Louis I. Louise Elizabeth's life was short, only reaching 38 years, and largely defined by dynastic expectation, domestic management, and gentle negotiation of her husband's whims. She had children, oversaw courtly affairs, and endured the slow, careful constraints of queenship in a foreign land. Her story is both sleepy and quietly tragic. A woman performing all the expected duties while navigating personal and political limitations with subtle skill. We can float north again to Denmark, to Sophia Magdalene of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, born in 1700. Sophia Magdalene married Christian VI of Denmark and spent much of her life managing courtly rituals, supervising charitable initiatives, and subtly influencing her husband's decisions. Her influence was mostly quiet, but effective. She maintained decorum, enforced etiquette, and cultivated stability in a court that might otherwise have succumbed to the slow chaos of human ambition. She died in 1770, leaving a legacy of careful, persistent order, another example of queens whose lives were defined by subtle endurance rather than dramatic events. Finally, for this segment, we can pause on Maria Carolina of Austria, born in 1752. Maria Carolina married Ferdinand IV of Naples and navigated a kingdom filled with political instability, foreign threats, and dynastic expectation. She bore many children, oversaw ceremonial functions, and subtly influenced the direction of policy without dramatic displays. Her life is a study in patient endurance, carefully observing, quietly persuading, and managing the slow accumulation of influence over decades. She died in 814, leaving behind a Naples shaped gently, persistently, and almost imperceptibly by her quiet efforts. What we begin to notice in this gradual drift through queens of smaller realms and lesser-known courts is a recurring pattern. Their power is cumulative rather than immediate, their influence subtle rather than obvious, and their lives often quietly tragic or mildly frustrating. They endured long hours of ceremonial duty, complex familial expectations, and the persistent burden of navigating politics that were rarely forgiving. Yet their lives shaped kingdoms, influenced dynasties, and often left lasting legacies that only become apparent when we look carefully. As you continue to drift through this historical reverie, imagine these queens walking softly through candlelit halls, arranging letters, supervising meals, planning minor alliances, or quietly observing their families. Their lives were filled with the slow, hypnotic rhythms of governance, patience, endurance, subtlety, and careful calculation. Unlike kings who are remembered for sudden battles, proclamations, or scandal, these queens' achievements were more like a soft, steady tide shaping the coastline over centuries, inescapable in their effect, yet almost invisible in their method. Now, as we float further through history, let's linger on the more eccentric, peculiar, and quietly tragic aspects of queens' lives. These are the stories that rarely make it into standard textbooks, but they reveal a lot about how royal women navigated expectations, personal quirks, and the slow-motion chaos of dynastic politics. Take Christina of Denmark, born in 1521. She married Francesco II Sforza of Milan as part of a typical political arrangement. Strategically convenient, personally unexciting. Christina's life was mostly defined by travel between courts, ceremonial obligations, and the slow accumulation of political influence, which she exercised in a way that historians often dismiss as minor, but which was crucial for her family's survival. She reportedly had a love of literature and learning, which sounds mundane until you imagine her reading quietly while courtiers fretted over protocol, diplomacy, and the inevitable minor scandals of court life. Christina died in 1590, leaving behind a life of subtle influence and intellectual curiosity, proving that quiet eccentricities often coexist with political necessity. Meanwhile, let's drift toward Hungary and Austria, where Maria Theresa of Spain, born in 1638, led a life punctuated by domestic oversight and mild frustrations with her husband, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Theresa's daily routines involved supervising her household, guiding her children, and gently nudging political decisions behind the scenes. Her influence was persistent, but never dramatic. She was not storming armies, not demanding sudden policy shifts, but her attention to detail shaped the Habsburg court over decades. Her quiet diligence is almost hypnotic when you consider the sheer amount of slow, repetitive work required to maintain a court. She died in 1683, leaving behind a legacy of careful endurance and domestic governance. Drifting west to France, we find Anne of Austria, born in 1601. Anne married Louis XIII and spent much of her life navigating a court dominated by Cardinal Richelieu, domestic politics, and the slow buildup of dynastic influence. She bore children, supervised ceremonies, and gently guided her son, Louis XIV, toward eventual absolute rule. Anne's life is a study in patience, enduring constraints, subtle manipulation, and careful nurturing of influence over decades. Her achievements are quiet but significant, demonstrating that long-term guidance and slow strategy can be as powerful as battlefield victories. She died in 1666, leaving France on the cusp of its most famous era under Louis XIV. Meanwhile, let's drift to Scandinavia, to Hedwig Eleonora's lesser-known contemporary, Ulrika Eleonora of Denmark, born in 1656. Ulrika Eleonora's life was largely ceremonial, yet she managed to subtly influence both Swedish and Danish courts through patience, social intelligence, and careful attention to etiquette. She supervised household affairs, guided younger courtiers, and occasionally intervened in political negotiations in ways that were almost invisible to the casual observer. Her quiet endurance exemplifies a recurring theme in these queens' lives: subtlety over spectacle, persistence over heroics. She died in 1693, leaving a legacy measured not in headlines, but in the careful shaping of courtly culture. Moving south again, we can pause on Maria Josepha of Saxony, born in 1731. She married Louis, Dauphin of France, and her life was filled with childbearing, domestic management, and the gentle exertion of influence within the royal household. Maria Josepha's life was tragically short. She died at the age of 37. Yet, within that span, she subtly guided her children, supported charitable works, and maintained stability in a court where small missteps could lead to enormous consequences. Her influence was quiet but deeply felt, a soft thread running through a turbulent dynasty. Meanwhile, in England, Caroline of Ansbach, born in 1683, married George II and became queen consort in 1727. Caroline's life was a mixture of domestic diligence, intellectual engagement, and subtle political guidance. She advised her husband, managed court affairs, and cultivated cultural initiatives quietly, without fanfare or scandal. Caroline's legacy is one of calm, persistent influence, showing that queens' power often lies in patient observation and the careful shaping of their environment rather than dramatic intervention. She died in 1737, leaving behind a court more organized and stable than it would have been otherwise. Now let's drift briefly to Portugal, to Mariana Victoria of Spain, born in 1718. Mariana Victoria married Joseph I of Portugal as part of a dynastic arrangement and spent much of her life quietly navigating court politics, ceremonial obligations, and domestic management. She bore children, supervised charitable works, and subtly influenced policy through patient observation and gentle persuasion. Mariana Victoria's life was long and steady. She died in 1781, leaving behind a kingdom subtly shaped by her persistence and discretion. Meanwhile, drifting east to Austria, we have Maria Christina of Austria, born in 1742. She married Albert of Saxony-Teschen and spent her life managing courtly rituals, overseeing charitable activities, and gently guiding family and political affairs. Maria Christina's influence was cumulative, subtle, and persistent. She died in 1798, leaving a quiet but enduring imprint on the courts she inhabited. Finally, for this segment, let's pause on Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, born in 1776, who became Queen of Prussia. Louise's life was marked by calm, dignified influence during a period of political upheaval and war. She managed court affairs, advised her husband, and cultivated a sense of stability amidst the slow turbulence of Napoleonic Europe. She died in 1810, leaving a legacy of patient guidance, gentle persuasion, and quiet resilience, a queen whose power lay in subtle, persistent action rather than dramatic displays. What we notice as we drift through these lives is a common thread: queens whose influence was slow, persistent, and cumulative rather than immediate or spectacular. Their power lay in endurance, careful observation, subtle persuasion, and management of daily routines that sustained dynasties over decades. Their personal lives were often quietly tragic, occasionally eccentric, and consistently defined by the tension between dynastic expectation and personal autonomy. As you continue to drift through this historical lullaby, imagine these queens in candlelit corridors, attending mass, reading letters, supervising households, and quietly shaping the world around them. Their triumphs were subtle, their tragedies mostly private, and their influence cumulative. They are the perfect companions for a slow night of reflection. Gentle, persistent, quietly powerful. Now, let's drift to some of the more obscure corners of European history, where queens exercised influence in ways that are often invisible to the casual observer. These are women whose lives are quietly fascinating, filled with eccentricities, small scandals, and patient management of family and court-perfect companions for a slow, reflective night. Take Maria Anna of Bavaria, born in 1660. She married Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and spent much of her life navigating court life, supervising households, and subtly influencing politics. Maria Anna reportedly had a love of music, which she cultivated quietly, hosting private concerts and patronizing composers. This might seem like a minor detail, but in the slow accumulation of cultural influence, it mattered. Her life was largely domestic, but through careful cultivation of taste and ceremony, she subtly shaped the aesthetic and intellectual environment of her court. Maria Anna died in 1690, leaving behind a legacy of quiet refinement and persistent influence. Meanwhile, drifting north, we find Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, born in 1729. She became Queen of Denmark and spent much of her life managing ceremonial duties, influencing minor policy decisions, and overseeing her household with meticulous care. Juliana Maria was not a revolutionary or a rebel, but she skillfully navigated political turbulence with patience and subtlety. Her life is a testament to the slow, persistent work of queenship, enduring minor frustrations, carefully arranging alliances, and quietly shaping her environment over decades. She died in 1796, leaving a court that was orderly and stable, a reflection of her steady hand. Drifting to Portugal, let's consider Maria Francisca of Savoy, born in 1646. She married King Afonso VI and later Peter II, navigating personal and political challenges with patience. Maria Francisca's life involved ceremonial supervision, domestic management, and subtle political guidance. She reportedly had a sharp intellect and a taste for literary pursuits, which allowed her to influence her court in ways that were gentle but persistent. Her life ended in 1683, marked by quiet accomplishment and careful guidance of her royal households. Meanwhile, in France, we encounter Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, born in 1685. She married Louis, Duke of Burgundy, and her life was characterized by childbearing, courtly etiquette, and gentle influence over her husband. She bore 3 children before dying tragically at 26, a short life, but one that demonstrates the slow accumulation of dynastic influence and the quiet endurance required of queens. Her legacy persisted through her children, particularly Louis XV, who inherited the throne thanks in part to her careful preparation of succession. Drifting east, let's pause on Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel-Bevern, born in 1715. She married Frederick II of Prussia, a king whose intellectual brilliance was matched by occasional bouts of irritability. Elizabeth Christine's influence was subtle. She managed courtly rituals, oversaw charitable works, and patiently guided her household through minor crises. She endured her husband's idiosyncrasies with a mixture of patience and mild exasperation. Her life is a perfect example of quiet, persistent influence, shaping a court and dynasty through endurance rather than dramatic action. She died in 1797, leaving Prussia subtly enriched by her calm management and steady guidance. Meanwhile, drifting south to Italy, we find Maria Carolina of Austria, born in 1752. She married Ferdinand IV of Naples and navigated a kingdom marked by political instability and foreign intrigue. Her life involved careful supervision of courtly routines, charitable works, and gentle but persistent influence on her husband's decisions. Maria Carolina was intelligent, politically aware, and capable of subtle manipulation when necessary. She died in 1814, leaving Naples quietly shaped by her persistent efforts, another example of the cumulative power of patient queenship. Now, floating back to England, we have Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, born in 1744. She married George III and became queen consort in 1761. Charlotte's life was marked by domestic management, ceremonial supervision, and patient guidance of her children. She had 15 children, oversaw charitable initiatives, and subtly influenced the monarchy's cultural and educational policies. Her influence was steady rather than dramatic, and her life demonstrates the quiet endurance required of queens who navigated complex households and political expectations. She died in 1818, leaving behind a legacy of calm, persistent influence. Meanwhile, drifting north to Sweden, we encounter Louisa Ulrika of Prussia, born in 1720. She married Adolf Frederick of Sweden and spent much of her life navigating court politics, ceremonial duties, and dynastic ambitions. Louisa Ulrika had a taste for the arts, particularly music and theater, which she cultivated quietly. Her influence was subtle, often exercised behind the scenes, but cumulative over decades. She died in 1782, leaving a court enriched by her careful cultivation of culture and persistent engagement with political and domestic affairs. Finally, for this segment, let's pause on Marie-Thérèse of France, born in 1638. She married Louis XIV as part of a dynastic arrangement and spent her life managing courtly routines, bearing children, and maintaining ceremonial obligations. Her life was largely domestic, with influence exerted quietly through advice, supervision, and patient endurance. She died in 1683, leaving behind a court shaped subtly by her persistence, patience, and attention to detail. A gentle reminder that queenship often involved slow, steady management, rather than spectacular acts. What emerges as we drift through these lives is a recurring theme. Queens whose influence was cumulative rather than immediate, whose daily routines involved patient endurance of ceremonial duties, domestic management, and subtle political guidance. Their eccentricities, minor scandals, and personal frustrations add texture to their lives, but the overarching pattern is one of quiet persistence. They shaped dynasties, guided heirs, and influenced culture in ways that are often invisible in standard historical narratives. As you continue to drift into this historical reverie, imagine these queens moving through palace corridors, attending mass, reading letters, supervising meals, and quietly guiding the world around them. Their triumphs were subtle, their eccentricities small, and their influence cumulative. They are companions for a long, reflective night, exemplifying calm endurance, quiet intelligence, and patient navigation of the slow, persistent pressures of dynastic life. Now, as we continue our slow glide through history, let's pause on some queens whose lives were marked by odd habits, subtle eccentricities, and quiet tragedies that rarely make the headlines. These women remind us that queenship was often less about spectacle and more about enduring the slow, persistent rhythms of power and domestic life. Take Louise of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, born in 1711. She married Frederick II, Duke of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, and spent much of her life managing her household, supervising ceremonies, and quietly influencing her children. Louise reportedly had a fondness for embroidery and music, minor hobbies that consumed hours of her days, but also allowed her to cultivate culture within her household. Her influence was subtle, cumulative, and persistent, shaping a duchy without dramatic proclamations or battlefield victories. She died in 1775, leaving behind a legacy of quiet endurance and domestic cultivation. Meanwhile, drifting to Bavaria, we find Maria Anna of Austria, born in 1683. She married Charles II of Spain and endured the peculiar challenges of a court where dynastic politics, ceremonial obligation, and personal health concerns intersected in exhausting ways. Maria Anna's life involved careful attention to protocol, patient management of her household, and subtle influence on her children. Her health was fragile, her days long, and her influence steady but mostly invisible. She died in 1754. Leaving a Spain shaped in small but lasting ways by her patient perseverance. Drifting north to Denmark again, let's consider Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, born in 1729. Juliana Maria became Queen of Denmark and spent much of her life overseeing courtly rituals, supervising charitable activities, and subtly guiding political decisions. Her influence was quiet and cumulative, often exercised behind the scenes, but it helped maintain stability in a kingdom prone to minor turbulence. She died in 1796, a testament to the persistent, slow work of queenship that is almost hypnotic when you imagine it unfolding day by day. Meanwhile, in Portugal, we can pause on Maria Francisca of Savoy, born in 1646. She married King Alfonso VI and later Peter II, navigating domestic and political challenges with patience. Maria Francisca's life involved ceremonial duties, charitable work, and subtle guidance of courtly affairs. She reportedly enjoyed music and literary pursuits, which allowed her to influence her court quietly yet persistently. She died in 1683, leaving a legacy marked by endurance and gentle cultivation of royal households. Drifting east, we meet Maria Christina of Austria, born in 1742. She married Albert of Saxony-Teschen and spent her life managing courtly routines, supervising charitable work, and guiding her family's political influence with gentle persistence. Maria Christina's life was quiet but cumulative. She shaped her courts in subtle ways over decades. She died in 1798, leaving a legacy that reflects patience, attention to detail, and enduring influence. Meanwhile, in England, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, born in 1744, married George III. Charlotte oversaw ceremonial duties, guided her large family, and quietly influenced cultural and educational initiatives within her kingdom. Her influence was persistent but rarely dramatic. She shaped the monarchy through daily diligence, patient guidance, and subtle persuasion. She died in 1818, leaving behind a calm, steady imprint on the British court. Drifting north to Sweden, Louisa Ulrika of Prussia, born in 1720, married Adolf Frederick of Sweden. She had a taste for the arts, particularly music and theater, which she cultivated quietly while also managing ceremonial duties and navigating dynastic politics. Her influence was subtle but cumulative, shaping cultural and political life over decades. She died in 1782, leaving a court enriched by her persistent engagement and calm oversight. Now, let's pause briefly on Marie-Thérèse of France, born in 1638. She married Louis XIV as part of a dynastic arrangement. Her life involved bearing children, supervising ceremonial obligations, and quietly influencing her husband's court through patient endurance and careful guidance. Marie-Thérèse's life demonstrates that queenship often involved subtle, persistent work rather than spectacular actions. She died in 1683, leaving a court shaped by her quiet, cumulative influence. Drifting south again, we can consider Maria Louisa of Savoy, Queen of Spain, born in 1688. She married Philip V of Spain and managed domestic routines, charitable works, and ceremonial duties with careful attention. Her life involved subtle influence over her husband and her court, gently shaping Spain's royal household over decades. She died in 1714, leaving a kingdom that reflected the quiet persistence of her work. Finally, let's drift to Austria for Maria Josepha of Saxony, born in 1731. She married Louis, Dauphin of France, and spent her life managing domestic routines, supervising courtly ceremonies, and quietly guiding her children. Her life, though tragically short, she died at 37, demonstrates the slow, cumulative power of patient queenship, enduring tedious routines, subtle influence, and the quiet shaping of dynastic futures. As we drift through these stories, one theme becomes increasingly clear. Queens often exerted influence through patience, subtlety, and persistence rather than drama. Their eccentricities, hobbies, peculiar tastes, minor scandals added texture to their lives, but the overarching pattern is one of quiet endurance and cumulative impact. They shaped dynasties, influenced heirs, and maintained cultural and political stability in ways that are often invisible unless we look closely. So, as you continue to drift, imagine these queens walking softly through palaces, supervising letters, attending mass, guiding their households, and quietly shaping the world around them. Their triumphs were subtle, their eccentricities small, their tragedies often private, and their influence cumulative. They are companions for a long night of reflection, quietly powerful, patiently enduring, and slowly shaping history in ways that only become apparent when we look closely enough. As we settle into the last leg of our historical drift, it's worth pausing to reflect on the subtle, persistent lives of these queens. Across centuries, kingdoms, and dynasties, one theme becomes clear. The power of queens was often invisible, cumulative, and enduring rather than immediate or spectacular. They shaped history not through dramatic proclamations or heroic battles, but through patience, observation, and the gentle exercise of influence. Take, for example, Maria Theresa of Austria. We've met her briefly before, but it's worth dwelling on her life as an exemplar of quiet persistence. Born in 1717, she inherited a sprawling, complex empire faced with internal strife, financial instability, and external threats. Maria Theresa's power was exercised through meticulous bureaucratic reform, careful oversight of education, supervision of her enormous family, and strategic marital alliances. She bore 16 children, an achievement that required not just endurance but constant attention to courtly ritual and dynastic expectation. Her influence was subtle, slow, and accumulative, but it reshaped Central Europe for decades. She died in 1780, leaving behind a legacy defined by structure, stability, and quiet authority. Meanwhile, we might revisit Catherine the Great of Russia, whose early life as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst is almost a study in patient observation. She didn't storm the throne with a sword. She learned, observed, waited. By quietly understanding her husband, Peter III, and the intricate politics of the Russian court, she positioned herself for influence and, eventually, rule. Her eccentricities, fascination with literature, philosophy, and cultural patronage added texture to her reign. But it was her cumulative patience that allowed her to quietly reshape an empire. Her life reminds us that influence can be a slow, careful accumulation of small, deliberate acts. And yet, not all queens had the freedom to ascend to personal power. Many spent their lives in quiet service, attending mass, supervising households, managing children, and enduring ceremonial obligations that consumed hours, days, and decades. Think of Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in Britain, or Maria Carolina of Austria in Naples. Their work was meticulous, often exhausting, rarely acknowledged in dramatic historical accounts, but essential to the functioning of their kingdoms. They were managers, cultivators, and observers roles that demanded patience, intelligence, and quiet endurance. Even the most eccentric queens fit this pattern. Louisa Ulrica of Prussia indulged in music, theater, and occasional courtly intrigue, yet her life remained a long, slow exercise in persistent influence. Maria Anna of Bavaria cultivated intellectual pursuits, guided her children, and shaped court culture subtly but decisively. Their eccentricities were not reckless. They were gentle extensions of their daily routines, small rebellions or personal pleasures that provided color to otherwise highly structured lives. The minor queens, the ones from smaller realms, overlooked courts, and peripheral dynasties demonstrate the same principle. Maria Francisca of Savoy, Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, and Maria Josepha of Saxony, among others, spent decades quietly guiding households, supervising ceremonies, and subtly shaping dynastic futures. They endured minor frustrations, peculiar husbands, and the slow grind of ceremonial obligations, yet their work persisted, quietly reshaping the political and cultural landscapes of their kingdoms. Their influence was cumulative, their endurance remarkable, and their impact often invisible to the casual observer. And this, perhaps, is the central lesson of these forgotten queens. Power is not always loud, immediate, or spectacular. Often, it is slow, patient, and persistent. Influence is exercised in small gestures, subtle interventions, and the patient management of daily routines. Triumph is measured not in headlines, but in decades of steady, thoughtful action. Eccentricities, minor scandals, and private tragedies provide texture, but they do not define the full scope of these women's accomplishments. As you drift further into this quiet historical reverie, imagine these queens in candlelit corridors, reading letters by morning sunlight, supervising meals, attending mass, guiding children, gently persuading husbands, and subtly shaping the world around them. Their lives were a series of cumulative acts, small, deliberate, and persistent. They endured long hours, tedious routines, personal frustrations, and social constraints. Yet through it all, they influenced the course of history in ways both subtle and enduring. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift further into sleep, Remember the quiet endurance of these forgotten queens. They exemplify patience, subtlety, and persistence. Their triumphs are invisible, but lasting. Their influence is cumulative, shaping empires and dynasties with the soft, persistent touch of daily life. They are the perfect companions for a long, reflective night, reminding us that history is often quietly written, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady, persistent acts of enduring influence. Let the image of these queens walking softly through palace corridors, supervising ceremonies, and quietly shaping dynasties linger as you drift off. Their lives were slow, patient, and cumulative, reminding us that sometimes the most profound influence is not loud or immediate, but persistent, subtle, and enduring over time. Good night, and let the quiet, persistent endurance of these queens accompany your dreams.